There's a really interesting story about Scotland's economic history that actually doesn't really get spoken about.
That is absolutely critical for Scotland's prosperity that is just falling through the cracks.
But the flip side of that is there's a huge economic opportunity.
What decisions are being made for either the benefit or the disbenefit of our economy here in Scotland? Right, folks, welcome back to Public Knowledge. If you, like me, have ever felt confused about how this country is run, how it works, then this is the podcast for you. Because we're on a mission to uncover the deals and relationships that are shaping the country we find ourselves in today, and for better or worse, the kind of country we could find ourselves in tomorrow. We break down the big stuff and make it make sense, one episode at a time. Now, in today's episode, we're demystifying the Scottish economy and asking what grand challenges and grand opportunities lie ahead of us. We're joined by Professor Graeme Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Professor of Economics at the Adam Smith Business School at Glasgow University. We start by locating the Scottish economy in the global context. Let's take it away.
So, as an economist, we would describe Scotland's economy as a small, open economy. So small in the sense that it's much smaller in scale than somewhere like the US or the European Union economy as a whole. So in the sense that we can't really influence global events, but global events can influence us. And that's really important in thinking about how the Scottish economy evolves over time. We hear a lot about how policymakers are trying to shape the economy, about how businesses are investing in our economy, but so much of what happens in our economy is actually shaped outside of Scotland. It's global trends, it's decisions taken elsewhere will have an impact on Scotland. So we call it small in that sense, and open in the sense that we are engaged into the wider economic community. So decisions that happen in other parts of the UK, decisions that take place in Europe, will all have really quite significant implications for Scotland. We have parts of our economy selling into overseas markets, and we have overseas markets and companies operating in Scotland.
Yeah, and can you give us some examples of where the broader global economy and changes in the trends in the global economy have impacted us?
Yeah, so you can look at it over the very long term, or even think about some examples today. So if you look at the long term, the change that we had in the global economy, where globalization led to a shifting of a rebalancing of where economic day-to-day activity took place, with a shift from manufacturing in relatively high-income economies into middle and lower-income economies, and this shift to services. That was a trend we didn't just see in the UK and Scotland, but it was all across Europe, North America and the places like that. And that's all had an impact on the Scottish economy over time. So some of the decline we've seen in manufacturing has been something that's been shared in many other places. The UK and Scotland have a much bigger decline, but it's been something that's been a general trend. So things like globalisation, things like changes in technology, the shortening of supply chains, all those sorts of things are something that are effects that have had an impact on Scotland over time. But even today, you look at the newspapers today and there's concerns about tariffs being imposed on certain aspects of the Scottish economy, so key sectors like the whisky industry and the like. So there's another good example about where decisions taken elsewhere, global decisions, have quite significant impacts for us here in Scotland.
Yeah, and I suppose would you put into that bracket as well our entanglement in the global energy markets as well, that have led to spiking gas prices in the UK, leading to inflation, leading to the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, very much so. So it's hard to think of many aspects of our economy where you can genuinely isolate it and say it's purely a Scottish effect. You mentioned energy prices, so clearly that has a negative impact. Spikes in energy prices have negative impacts for many in our economy and society. But then it leads to greater investment in oil and gas industry or potential other aspects of the domestic energy system, which then might have positive effects. So you get these ripple effects that we call them across our economy from changes in global outcome.
I think that's so interesting because as we look at the broader trends where more and more is being globalized, people, even the workforce, they are so much more mobile than they used to be. But we still operate in a government structure and a society structure where we want accountability for those things from national bodies. And you mentioned the manufacturing, and it just makes me think over the years how much we've seen about people lamenting the fact that there's been a decline in manufacturing and wanting a manufacturing renaissance. But it's interesting, isn't it? People want answers from national institutions about these global changes.
Yeah, very much so. And I think something that manufacturing, I think, is a fascinating area within our economy where you see these global effects that have an impact on our manufacturing base because essentially cost was the big driving factor in the global manufacturing industry. So how can you produce things relatively cheaply? And that was a real challenge to high income economies like Scotland. But actually what you're seeing in more recent times is a shift into things like quality and actually thinking about advanced manufacturing where it's less about cost but more about how innovative, how dynamic, how ingenious new ideas might be. And that actually is where there's a real advantage for Scotland given our very strong skills base and given the basic underpinnings we have in our economy. So actually there's a real potential that many people are looking at manufacturing and seeing it as a real positive potential aspect of the economy that could grow into the future.
That's such an interesting point, and I think probably speaks to the fact that not many of us necessarily understand what these new opportunities, these advanced manufacturing opportunities are, because still within our cultural psyche we think, even when we think of wind turbines, we're thinking of the towers and the blades, the things that you can see, feel and touch. When you talk about advanced manufacturing, what do you mean?
So essentially what you're largely talking about there is manufacturing that is less about the traditional view of thinking about here's a big conveyor belt that people are working on it and it's very labour intensive, to be much more about linking the boundary between research and development and innovation, about intangible capital, so the ability for people to generate ideas to turn them into products, but also about the services that sit alongside a manufacturing product and how do they get linked into the manufacturing base. And again, that's where the evolution of the global economy into manufacturing, the evolution of the Scottish economy provides new opportunities. The other big thing that you mentioned, again, as you were talking there about global trends versus national regulation, which again come crashing into this, is the growth of AI, for example. That's clearly something which is a global phenomenon, but actually there's going to be really important regulations. But AI in itself has a really important link into manufacturing, about how you can do things more quickly and in a much more timorous way. And that, again, is where countries like Scotland have a comparative advantage.
Well, that's great, and I really want to dive into that. But what I always do is I just love diving into the detail immediately. And let's take a step back. And you've really clearly set out, locating Scotland in the global sense. And now could you locate it for us a bit more within the UK economy as well?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting, I think, story about Scotland's economy, Scotland's economic history that actually doesn't really get spoken about too much. So if I was to answer you very quickly about where we are just now in the UK economy, the standard answer would be that Scotland typically ranks about third behind London and the South East in terms of prosperity, in terms of its economy. Strong skills base, strong university sector, really effective infrastructure, some core sectors that perform really strongly. And that's the standard story that you'd think about Scotland's economy. It's the debate that we have pretty much every day in Scotland about how we can build on that success, about how we're doing relative to these competitors and where we might go next. But actually, if you go back not that far in economic history time, so I think about the time, when my dad was entering the labour force in the 1960s, Scotland's economy was at a really low ebb. It was one of the poorest parts of the UK. It had suffered, really challenging deindustrialisation, large amounts of out-migration, particularly of young people leaving Scotland looking for new opportunities. And it's a very different story of Scotland's economy in the UK relative to the one that we have now. But over the last 50, 60 years, you've seen a real turnaround in Scotland's relative performance. The growth of key sectors and things like financial services, oil and gas, energy, growing the economy, and Scotland in many ways catching up with other parts and actually outperforming other parts of the UK over that time period. And I think it's quite an interesting thing that's quite important that we don't lose sight of, that things can change both for the better, but also there have been times you don't have to look that far back to see Scotland's economy in really quite a challenging position.
I think that nicely leads us on to, some of the challenges that we can see coming down the road, in which, the institutions that you work for and represent have done such great analysis and research into this, particularly around, ageing population, demographic changes. Can you talk us through some of the structural issues that Scotland as a nation faces in terms of its broader economy?
So there's probably several what we would call grand challenges that face the Scottish economy. The first thing I should say is that most of these challenges are shared challenges across all similar economies to Scotland, all high income, small economies. As you mentioned, demographics. I mean, that's something that's affecting many countries around the world, particularly in Europe, but also in key parts of North America and in Asia as well, where essentially the boom in the population that we had after the Second World War, the baby boomers coming through, their children, their grandchildren are all beginning to move into retirement age. And that's meaning that there are fewer and fewer young people relative to older people than we had back, say, 50, 60 years ago. And that poses a challenge to the economy because it means that there are issues about skills shortages. You have fewer potential people in employment contributing to the economy, and it also puts pressures on public finances. So thinking about how we respond to that demographic challenge is one of the big issues facing the economy, and it will be one of the big issues we face over the next few decades. There's obviously things like the transition to net zero and the shift to the low carbon economy. The challenge of that is that we've basically built an economic model for 250 years that has been built on carbon, and we're going to have to remove carbon pretty quickly from our economy in order to deliver on our ambitions around climate change and the transition to net zero. So how you do that is going to be very difficult, in the sense it's going to require a radical transformation to every aspect of our day-to-day economic life. But the flip side of that is there's a huge economic opportunity, because there's a huge investment opportunity, there's a huge employment opportunity, there's huge export opportunity as we move to those new industries, the new types of energy, the green economy, and that provides a significant opportunity for Scotland's economy. There are also some structural factors, challenges that exist in the Scottish economy that are maybe not new or things that are not we've known about for a very long time. So we know we have challenges around inequality that are higher than many of our international comparators. We know of the challenges around levels of inactivity, for example. So pockets of our country have faced some real, quite significant economic challenges. And they've been there for a very long time, and they're very stubborn, very difficult to get to find the solutions to these real challenging problems. So one of the big questions is, well, can we actually start to make progress on these issues we've known about for a very long period of time?
And want to definitely come back to that, actually, in terms of making progress on those things. Before we do, would you be able to give us a sense of the main sectors of the Scottish economy now as it stands, how we've kind of come to that place, and how you see that evolving in the next 10 to 15 years?
So I guess the easiest part to that is what's happened, or what are the sectors we've got just now, before I do some crystal ball gazing into what happens next. I mean, the largest sectors in our economy are the types of ones that you'd probably think of. So things like financial services and professional services. So the strengths in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee and places like that, we've got these financial services and professional services elements that sit alongside that. I mean, interestingly, nearly about 3/4 of our economy is actually a service-based economy nowadays. So those elements are key aspects and key strengths of our economy. Public services, again, the growth of not just what you might think of direct public services like healthcare and government, but actually kind of quasi-public services like universities, education, etc., are another, the big aspect of our economy. And traditionally things like manufacturing, which were very large parts of our economy, so 40% of our economy about 50 years ago is now down to just over about 10% of our economy. That's not to say it's not important, it's not high value, but as an overall share of our economy, it's much less. And one thing that I would say is that you get variations across the country in terms of how important some key sectors are. So if you go to fishing communities, clearly fishing is a very significant part of those local towns and local communities, but at a national level they're on a smaller scale relative to what they've been in the past. So those are the kind of areas where Scotland focuses upon. That's the areas where we've got the largest levels of employment and activity. I think going forward, that's always a challenge to kind of gaze into the future about what that might be and where that might head. There are some things that we know, coming back to these grand challenges, where the economy will grow and develop into. So we know that we're going to shift into a new energy transition, and that's going to radically shape the nature of Scotland's economy, and there's real potential in there. We know, for example, that with an ageing population, there's going to be a significant investment into the public services that support an ageing population, whether that be healthcare, social care, and the like. But as I mentioned, there's also some really interesting opportunities coming down the line in areas like advanced manufacturing and activities there.
Yeah, I mean, do you think we really know enough about our economy? Because I think that's the thing, is that I get a sense also when I look at the papers that cover Scotland, we don't seem to have a wealth of information as there might be about the broader UK economy, about what's going on. I think, the business press in Scotland has been all but decimated. It's certainly diminished hugely in the past 20 years. I mean, how much of a problem do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a real challenge. So one of the interesting things is that devolution was hoped that it would lead to a different type of debate about Scotland's economy and lead to a vibrancy and a challenge and new ideas, radical ideas, debate about where our economy was heading. And what's quite interesting is that if you look at essentially the institutions, the public institutions to deliver the economy, in many ways they have stepped up to the plate and they have made significant developments. So if you look at the level of information that is now produced by government to understand the Scottish economy, it's miles better than what it was at the start of devolution. There's much greater richness in terms of economic statistics. There's organisations like ourselves doing independent forecasting, which didn't exist even up until about a decade ago. So there's a lot more going on in the institutional space. But you're right, I think the real sadness, the real concern has been that if you look at the broader community, that hasn't really embraced or picked up that debate about the economy. So like all kind of traditional media, we've seen the real pressure on journalists and newspapers in Scotland, and that's led to a decline in the business commentary, the economic analysis that exists. We also, to be fair, with the exceptions of my former colleagues in places like the Fraser of Allender Institute, we haven't seen that vibrancy come up in terms of economic think tanks in comparison to elsewhere in the UK. I mean, you look at the UK and there's a lot of think tanks operating the space, both completely neutral, but also right across the political spectrum, coming up with ideas on the left and the right. And we don't have that so much in Scotland. There are some notable exceptions, but we don't have that same community. And I think that's been a real shame and a disappointing outcome in devolution, because it was hoped that would be the case, but I don't think it's really lived up to expectations.
No, I mean, that's seriously one of my main frustrations, actually. I used to run a think tank down in Westminster that was UK focused, and I, because I'm from here, because I'm from Edinburgh, I would always bring in the angle of Scotland. And honestly, even though, it just wasn't necessarily grasped or gripped really particularly well. And then you find that maybe institutions that are based up here are focused on the Holyrood venue on the Scottish Parliament that perhaps the broader macroeconomic policies that we need to see change for Scotland to prosper, there's not that advocacy necessarily going on down in Westminster.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole host of different issues, I think, around resources. And I think an interesting is the more that Scotland's economy and the policy debate in Scotland has evolved and moved in different directions to the rest of the UK, when I speak to colleagues in the rest of the UK, the more nervous they are about engaging in the Scottish debate because it is different. And the last thing they want to do is intervene and make a contribution that turns out not to be correct because they don't understand the context there. So in some ways, we've kind of we had our own debate, but we've maybe not built the institutions and the capacity and had that media engagement that, again, as I said, I think people would have hoped for at the start of devolution.
And so would you say then that there is an area of policy that is absolutely critical for Scotland's prosperity that is held at Westminster level, say, that is just falling through the cracks? That's no one in Hollywood is focusing on because they're focusing on the Scottish Parliament, and no one in Westminster is focusing on because they're focused on how those powers affect England, for example.
I think that one of the areas where there is, and when we come on to this, when we discuss about the kind of interactions between policymakers, I think there's probably a good understanding of reserved policies and a good understanding of devolved policies, and the discussions take place quite separately in that regard. I think there's a really interesting thing about how do you get these two powers to work in the most effective direction. So if you take something like the energy transition, what is the policy debate which is about, well, how can you use the levers the devolved levers at Holyrood in the most effective way and get the choreography right with the same policy levers that are being used at Westminster and align these in a way which means that you're able to get the best possible outcomes. I think that we've got quite a good understanding of devolved areas and quite a good understanding of reserved areas, but there typically is much less conversation about how you integrate the two. And I think that's largely because there's been a lot of the discussion about, in the policy world, about thinking that devolved policies are separate. You can separate out devolved policies from reserved policies. You have Westminster government does this group of policies, Scottish government does this group of policies, and then that's it. And it's like as though you're operating completely autonomous. But particularly in areas around climate change, particularly around areas like the economy, the overlap between these policy areas is so close and so integrated that actually you need to think about them as a totality in there. And again, because you've got two governments of different colour, governments of different constitutional views, having that integrated view is always going to be relatively challenging.
And I think that's it. You've hit the nail on the head, because fundamentally and ultimately we are, in a political system where the politicians are, depending on which stripe they are, which party they represent, we feel a little bit at the mercy of that right now. That's how I feel. I question whether that's how you feel. And I guess my question is, to what extent do you want to see any changes in the formal mechanisms by which these two governments engage with each other and the transparency with which they engage with each other, so that we know what decisions are being made for either the benefit or the disbenefit of our economy here in Scotland?
My sense, looking at the way policy debates have taken place, is that you've very much had a debate about devolved policies and a debate about reserved policies, and both governments commenting on each other's policies. But actually, if you take a step back and think about something like net zero, we know the kind of the transition plan that is needed. But do you have a situation where both governments are actually sitting down and detailing out how you actually get to that transition plan? And I think that's the really interesting bit, as you kind of look at these really wicked cross kind of cross-policy area responsibilities where you actually have to have that effective planning. Now, I would say that that's an issue between the two governments. It's probably an issue within government as well, and about how joined up government is, but it's certainly an area where I think as the devolution settlement becomes a bit more mature, they're actually thinking about the problem, the collective problem that you're trying to address, and then how you get the levers from across different governments to work most effectively.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Public Knowledge. I hope you found it valuable, and there's plenty more where that came from. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow us on social media, and do have a think about which 3 people you know who would find this episode valuable, and send it to them. Help us build a critical mass of people bringing public knowledge to light, because some things should never be kept in the dark. Till next time.